This amazing engine is going in that amazing plane. Welcome to video 4 of the Super Bandit assembly. This is going in there very soon. Let's continue on with this build. All right, so last episode we finished off with getting our turbine all set up on our bypass mount. Now what we're going to do is we are going to take the turbine out and we are going to focus on getting the bypass and extension painted and finished. So in preparation to paint our bypass and extension for the front here, we've sanded those guys out. Install pinhole filler from BVM on the bypass. So we've done that in the top section. That's really the worst of it is in this area. The rest of it is quite smooth. So we're going to let that cure and set up, and we will give this a final sand and cleaning before we put primer on it. All right, so we've got our first layer of primer installed on our parts here, just using our little tiny portable spray system with a furnace filter. Works really awesome. Vent the vacuum outside, works great. And so that's one coat on there. We'll put another one on, and it is looking awesome. So with our bypass underway, we got our second coat added on there. It's time to do our elevator rods for the back end. I know we've been talking about this a lot. So we've got our two arrow shafts here that we will cut up, but we're going to make our elevator control push rod assembly. So pretty straightforward stuff. All we're doing is following all of the dimensions here on the plans, and we're just going to make two of these guys up. So our tail is installed, our horizontal stabs are done and installed. So those are tricky to get on. Obviously we got our tail cone on as well, and we do some special things here because these are not coming off ever unless they need to come off. We put a drop of, so this is just a carbon rod that goes in here. It's a wooden block with one of those Healy coil inserts. So I put a drop of black CA in there. That's the rubberized CA before I put the 440 bolt in. These guys here, the four, they're both on each side, they're both Loctited with blue Loctite. The center one here holding the cone on, we've got a groove in the pin that goes in, so that's nice and solid. Also put some CA in there, so those are all good. Now we have to do a little bit of sanding in the back end here. If you look at our control rods there on the right and left side, our little balls, they're very close to the former that joins the tail cone to the fuselage. So we've got to get that sanded out a little bit and make some room. I knew we'd have to do that, but I just wanted to make sure we waited until the plane was essentially getting put together. So I've marked those out with Sharpie. We'll Dremel those off, and we can get our rudder installed here pretty quick as well. Well, we've got the horizontal stab and vertical stabs installed, and they look magnificent. So it was not overly difficult. We created the linkages and rods and everything back there. Probably the hardest part was actually there's little wooden discs, two that get mounted back here and one that gets mounted way in the front. And getting those wooden discs installed, I CA'd them in place, and then now I've gone in and installed high sol in there on the discs. I think that'll show up on camera. Because those being mounted solidly creates a very solid rod structure. So anyways, that's done. The rudder is installed, Loctited in place, and we've got our disc here, you can see, and I've just put high sol on it as well. We'll come in and paint those black afterwards. The one change that we made over the stock setup is we used 440 clevises here instead of the stock 256 clevises. That's just a strength change for our Speed Demon. So that is it for the tail section. Looks fabulous. Very nice. All right, so our bypass has been final coated black and also clear coated with 2K clear. So the product that we used for the clear coat, this is kind of a cool product because it's 2K clear, but it doesn't mix. So generally with 2K clears, you push a button on the bottom, it punctures the two components, you mix them, and you've got like 8 hours to use them. This stuff mixes at the nozzle. I've been really happy with it, and it is cool stuff. So that's done. Setting that aside, The extension piece here for the front of the bypass, didn't bother using pinhole filler and trying to get this part smooth. Basically just trying to save weight as much as possible. You know, if we start filling that in and sanding it out, we're gonna add extra ounces where we don't need them. So that stuff's done. Okay, so next thing we need to work on with the aircraft is the fuel tanks. Reason for the fuel tanks is they need to go in the back main fuel tanks anyways before the bypass goes in. So that is the next thing we're going to work on, fuel tanks. So we've got one of the fittings already, or the holes already opened up for the fittings, and the vent fitting is going to go somewhere on the top here. So going to get these things cleaned up and started to sanding the joints and everything. First thing though, we have to get our fuel fittings installed. Okay, so the BVM hardware here is a little bit different than the standard kind of hardware. So there's actually a nut on the back side. And basically, obviously this threads together like that, and your tank goes in between these two pieces. And then the silver piece has a double-sided O-ring flange type seal. So all of this stuff needs to be installed before you put the tanks together to do it properly. So these holes are a little undersized right now, so we're going to use our step drill and size that up one more notch, and then we'll be able to get these things glued in. So what we can do is the vent fittings are also the same kind of setup, so they've got a nut on the back side. So we don't have to use the nut, but we probably will end up using the nut and getting these epoxied in very much the same way as the brass fitting. So we're going to get all those done. Now we've got 3 fittings here, plus an extra high flow vent. So the reason we have 2 high flow vent fittings is we're doing 2 vent lines on the hopper tank or the front tank. So each one of those vents will feed the saddle tanks. So it's truly a very high flow setup. Rather than having one vent come out to a T and split, this is going to have 2 separate feeds, so 1 and 2. And then we've got a huge T. This is for the vent fitting. So our vents on the main tanks will come together on this T and then go outside the aircraft. So that is the setup that we're using on this beautiful plane. We've also decided that we're going to paint the tanks as well too, so we'll paint those shiny black. The other thing we'll do is we'll leave a visible window on this, this front tank. So anyways, we'll go through that process. Next thing to do is get these fittings all sized properly for these tanks. Okay, so we got our tanks all glued together. They're just resting right now. That's quite a process. We're almost out of high sol, 9462. And so I used West Systems 610 on the fittings, so all of the fittings on the tanks. And then I used 9462 on joining the tanks together. And they're resting, and we'll leave them alone. And if you're a fan of Nez, she had a bath today. She wasn't very happy during her bath, but she's better now. Okay, so while we're waiting on our tanks to do their thing, we've got to kind of find some other things to do. So we've got a couple things to do here as far as dremeling goes. We've got to open up this opening right here. That's where our wires are going to come in and out. So that is the one opening we're going to do in this entire wing fuse joint. We've got to sand out a little bit more of this area. That's necessary because we can't actually get our tanks in here with this being down where it is. So we've got to bring this up a little bit in the center a bit more. So we're going to get that stuff done. Once that stuff's sanded out, we're going to focus on our wing wiring and getting that run to the front of the aircraft. Okay, so we got our openings done here. And while I was back here, did a little bit of touch-ups, a little detailing work. So the little tabs here that our plate glues into, painted those guys black. And we're moving on to the air brake right now. So we've taken the air brake off the aircraft, sitting here. So we're gonna get the servo set up for this and get this thing programmed. All right, so air brake is pretty straightforward. You just take 2 440 rods, put a little piece of threaded rod in between, and we put CA there to lock it in place. So the off position, we've got it, or closed position is sort of adjustable, and that's what it looks like there. The max air brake position essentially is the arm and linkage and everything locked out, and then you've got the carbon rod, everything just working. And the design of the air brake going in and out of this thing is really nice. So if you ever had to take this out for any reason, It's just the 3 screws here to get it in and out, and you don't have to disassemble anything from the inside. And of course, we are Loctiting these guys in place. We've got 2 angled head screws, whatever they're called. And then the front one is a button head. And yeah, it works really well. Good system. There we go. That's the air brake installed. So this is maxed out right now, and we've got tons of travel there, which is great. So perfect setup. And then for our close position, we're just adjusting our servo endpoint. All right, so we spent a little bit of time here running our wires forward. So we've got our 1 elevator wire from this side, the left side of the plane there. And on the right side of our plane, we've got our elevator line and our rudder line run forward as well. So with those guys done, they're run forward towards the location where the electronics are going to be mounted in the plane. So we're kind of thinking about electronics now at this point. So I've kind of got a bit of a layout here, installed the front nose gear as well as the leg, and kind of playing with layout right now. So I have mounted my Cortex where it's going to go. We do have our mount for our primary Rec 7 receiver mounted there. And the other 2 major components that we need to put in the front end here are the LGC22 gear controller and the other receiver, which is our clone receiver. Now our UAT is going on this side. That's just going to get mounted to that board right there. And we've talked about that previously. So it doesn't leave much for electronics room on this side of the fuselage, but we do have more room on the other side of the fuselage. So our steering servo goes here, our nose door servo goes in this pocket right there. So I think we're going to probably have a little bit of room on this outer wall, I think like that, to mount our gear controller. And that doesn't interfere with our upper plate here, with our little shelf. We can't mount the controller on the board itself because our steering arm needs to come through that hole right there and come to our steering system. So that needs to be kind of left wide open, which means that if we mount this right like that, it should all jive with our system. So a little bit of playing around here. So because we're limited on space, the next thing I'm going to do is to set up our steering system. Now the steering servo we're using is an MKS 747 high voltage, great little servo. So that's going to be perfect in there. We did fill in our little space. We have to sand that out a little bit to fit the servo in. So I think we're good to screw this tray down now. So we'll screw that guy back down and then we'll mount our servo in its pocket. Well, I tell you, these tanks are an absolute bear to get installed. We did get them installed. Now I took the air brake out because I think the air brake, the carbon arms on the air brake here kind of prevent the tanks from going in. So you kind of have to lay the tank in underneath the intake, kind of slide it in and up. Now one of the things I had to change right away here, and I'm glad I kind of fit these tanks in, was our vent lines were facing like this. And they were basically, the end of the vent line here was almost touching the fuselage piece. So I just took my pliers. This 610 epoxy is kind of kicked off already, but well, obviously it's been a few hours, but it's still soft enough that you can work with it. So I was able to turn it. We're going to have to grind this out a little bit and do a little bit of filling in this area on the epoxy most likely, but that's not a big deal. So now our vent lines will come right over to the T and then go forward and out. Now we're just working on equipment layout here, and I think we've got everything figured out. So this is probably how things are going to work out in this aircraft. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to put the Zykoy data relay module down here. Now you don't really need access to these things as long as you run a Y cable from the data port. So you Y the cable, and the data port is going to go, one side of the Y cable goes to the telemetry module, the other side of the Y cable goes to an open port, which you can plug your little portable screen into, and it works perfectly. So this can be buried no problem. We're going to put our SPEC 30, which is our main power converter, underneath here as well too. And then we're also going to put the fuel pump most likely right in this area right here. So basically right beside the all of this stuff. So the air brake bolt's in here, obviously, and that's going to sit beautifully right there. And it's going to be on this other side here. And then our pump line from our UAT will come down underneath and go straight into the fuel pump intake right there. So that is a nice compact area for that fuel pump. We have to do a bit of a special mount for it. We're going to put our Zycoi sequencer on here. We've got our servo lead set up for our steering. That worked out awesome. The stock setup was supposed to come at an angle like this, but it actually didn't line up well with the hole, and it would have interfered with our landing gear controller. So we ran it straight. Not going to worry, or not going to interfere with anything else. Gear controller is going to go there, and our primary receiver stuff is going right on top. So I think we've got everything laid out that we need, and it's going to be perfect. All right, rocking and rolling on the Super Bandit. We've left our tanks sitting in there overnight. Maybe they've compressed a little bit and they'll fit a little bit better. So we're going to pull these guys out now, and we are going to, first thing we're going to do is leak test them. So we want to pressurize them, make sure there's no leaks, and then we're going to be painting them. But we want to make sure we test them first, so if we do have any leaks or anything, we can fix them, obviously, before we paint them. So we'll be painting the primaries black. We'll be painting the saddles black. We'll be painting the front tank black as well. But we're going to tape off a little strip in the front here, visibility strip, so you can see the fuel level when you are checking it out. So I think we might just do a strip up to about here. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it all works out. We may do 2 strips up here as well, but basically you just want to be able to visibly see how much fuel is left in the saddle tank, so you can adjust your flight times and stuff accordingly. So one of the nice things about the tank designs like this, where you've got the 2 pieces and you put your fuel fittings in before you glue the tanks together, is quite simply that you can clean out all the dust before you put the tanks together. So when we confirm that these guys are indeed not leaking and good to go, then we just do our fueling fitting. We do our pickup fitting, and then we're ready to go. We don't have to worry about rinsing the tanks out or anything. So to pressurize tanks, all I do is I take a piece of Tygon or fuel tubing and have one end heated and squished and closed off. The other end I use this is stuff from a BVM build, the F16 build, the really floppy fuel line. And we just pressurize it with your mouth and you cinch it off like this. And I just like to confirm that the fitting's not leaking anything, which is good. And then what I'll also do in this case, because we messed with this fitting, is I'm gonna just get it out of the way right away and just spray some soapy water around the fittings, just to confirm that our fittings aren't leaking. And if that's good, we're gonna leave these things sit to be pressurized. Now you really only need to leave them for a couple hours basically. If you leave them for a couple hours and they still have pressure in them, you're fine. If you have time, leave them overnight, but I found a couple hours is perfect. All right, so we've got both of our wiring harnesses done up here. Now the next thing we're gonna do is put some snakeskin on these guys. I just wanna show you a couple tricks and tips here. Generally, I kind of do it 50% of the time. I'll put my label on here and then I'll do them all afterwards. In this case, because we're so tight for space and everything in the equipment installation area, I'm going to do all my crimping and ends and everything on the servo or the receiver side afterwards. So this is how we're doing things. The other little tip I have here for you, and I think this even qualifies as a tip time, and this tip time is brought to you by trusty bent screwdriver. Okay, when you're doing the ashlock connectors up, you'll see, hopefully this will show up on camera, there's a little arrow right there on that edge. I always use that arrow as my signal line, or in a case like the brakes here, it's my positive. So my wire layout is always the same. It's always white, red, blue. So if we're missing the white on the gear and the brake here, it's still red, blue. And we're always putting our signal on that arrow. That way, when you do the other side of the connector, which is usually done first on the wing side, it's super simple. So when I do these guys up, I don't even need to look at my other connector. I know that it's white, red, blue, starting from this end. So those guys are done up. We're gonna get the other, everything kind of snakeskin together. But our tanks have been sitting for a couple hours now, so let's check these guys and see if they're still holding pressure. So what we're looking for is some pressure release. All right, you ready? Tank number 1, we got pressure. Tank number 2, we got pressure. That's a good sign. I was most worried about these guys. So tank number 3, awesome, perfect. Tanks pass with flying colors. All right, so our wiring connectors are done. So we are going to wait to install these until we get the tanks installed, because there's kind of a pretty small, narrow path for those guys to go in, but at least those guys are done. They're too long, so we'll be able to cut them down to be the right length. Now I've taken the fittings off of our tanks. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna do our fuel lines inside the tank, so our clunk pickups. Now the saddle tanks, because we're pulling from these saddle tanks at the same time, we want to make sure that everything is identical with these saddle tanks. So we put the pickups were installed already. We put our vent lines in exactly the same spot, and our lines inside the tank will also be at exactly the same spot. And so it's important to do that to try and get the most even fuel pickup system possible. All right, so we've got our plans laid out here. Now you can see basically they were pretty simple, straightforward stuff. So pretty straightforward setup. This is exactly how we're doing it, except we've got 2 vent lines coming to the 2 saddles. So very much the same. All right, so here's a tank before we put the clunk in. So we've got the tank all set up. Obviously, we've talked about how we don't have to clean those guys out. And here's our typical clunk setup right here. So we've got both ends tie wired, we've got our BVM tubing, and what I do before I install this guy is I take a little bit of silicone oil and put it on these O-rings. Now, these O-rings did not have silicone oil on them when we tested them, so this will basically ensure that it gets a nice seal. You've got an O-ring on both sides of those seals, and then we'll thread this guy in. Take our 11/16 wrench, give it a little hi-ya, just a little snuggy snug, and we are good to go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, and I've already checked the clunk length there on the other tanks. So what we're going to do now is we're going to prep these tanks for paint. So what I'm going to do is give these guys a light sanding all over the place, because it's very, very smooth, and the paint will not stick to that well at all. And so yeah, we're going to sand these guys down and give them some texture, clean them off, and then we will get some paint installed on them. Obviously, we're going to prep off our fuel fittings as well too. That's kind of an important step. All right, so using our little portable paint booth setup here, we got our first coat installed. Actually, 2 coats installed on this side of the tank. So we still have to do the other sides of the tanks, but I wanted to get this side done first. I didn't want to have to hang them or anything, so we're doing this side and then we'll do the other side. So that's 2 coats on there. One thing that really helps, and again, do this at your own risk, is heat up your cans either in hot water. I just like to use my heat gun, so I'll warm them up, shake them, warm them up, shake them, do that a bunch of times. And then also heat your part too. So if you, just like painting landing gear, if you heat up the part, make sure it's nice and warm, it just goes on and lays down so much nicer. So anyways, those tanks are good. We'll leave them be, and then we'll flip them over and do the other side. And then we're also getting ready to install our ceramic paint on the back portion of our bypass. So I've laid down some tape. We've sanded that part of the bypass out, and we've got our heat shield here. This stuff goes on pretty thick, so like something like this, there's about half a can left. That's probably going to be enough to deal with this bypass and then the back part of our bypass cover. So this, just to give you some reference here, this can will probably be empty by the end of this build. So anyways, let's get that installed just using a brush. All right, so 2 days ago we put clear coat on the tanks and they are all cured now and ready to go. So those are done. We still have to just pull the tape off of our fittings, but they turned out awesome. When I did like the front tank here, basically I didn't clear coat the bottom, right? I mean, there's no point for it, that's all buried. And so that was the reason. I just put it down flat like this, clear coated all the way around it, and they turned out perfect. We've also got our bypass done here as well too, so that is all 4 coats of ceramic paint on there, and that turned out awesome as well. Got a picture from Jeremy. I don't know if I'm going to share the picture or not. No, I'm not going to share the picture. In the next episode, the final episode for the Super Bandit, you guys are going to see the bypass cover. It looks so cool. It is so awesome, very reminiscent of this. That's all I'm going to say. So with this stuff done, we can now start getting our tail section installed. So final shot here, up the tailpipe, and I did put a little bit of CA on our screws holding our plastic horns on, the black CA, just to hold the screws in place, but we are ready to now install our pipe, start getting our fuel tanks installed and going through that whole process. So we have to follow the process here. We can lay the pipe in, that's easy to do. But then what we have to do is we've got to get our tanks installed first. So that's the whole procedure here. Pipe goes in, tanks go in. We have to make sure we put our fittings, our fuel line on the tanks. When the tanks go in, then we can put our bypass and bypass extension in, and then we can run our wing wiring, and then we can get our air brake reinstalled. So that is the process we're following on the final steps for this fuselage. So we've installed our line here on our saddle tank pickups. So those are done. We've also installed some safety wire, and the tanks are darn tight to fit in there, but that is how they fit. So that's the reason we're putting these on ahead of time, is because there's no access to those areas. So I've cut these tubes long, and they are of equal length, which is important. So when we get the front tank installed, if we cut 1 inch off of this fuel tubing, we do the same on both sides and they end up an equal amount. Tanks are sitting right there like that. We're going to get our other one installed now. Okay, so we've got our bypass, our front duct, our tank, saddle tanks installed. This was very, very tight to get in here because the parts are painted and they're not exactly slippery. They're kind of, you know, sticking against each other, and just everything is so accurately fit. We've got our pipe bolted on to our bypass. We got a little bit of rub marks and stuff on there, but there's really not a whole lot you can do because everything's just so tight. So anyways, we used red Loctite on these guys. We used a bit of black CA on those guys right there. They go into the plastic or the carbon L brackets. And the bypass and tanks are installed. Pipe is installed as well. And that is super cool. So that worked out awesome. Let's take the engine and drop it in. So I'm not entirely sure that we will be leaving this engine in. We may if we are able to run the tubes and everything, but probably not. Anyways, we're just getting it in to check the alignment and everything. It's definitely still a tight fit. It kind of just pushes everything out because our bypass is squished a little bit this way. So when I drop the engine in, it kind of spread the ears out, but that really solidifies everything. So this is all very stiff right now. Let's take a look at the back and see what it looks like. All right, so we're pretty close back here. We may have to do a little bit of adjustment, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this bolted in place, just kind of see how it looks when it's bolted, and we'll check from that perspective as well once we get those bolts tightened up. All right, so there is a shot of the pipe and turbine and everything. I don't know if it's going to show up 100%, but we're just a little bit low on the turbine. Not much. We're talking about millimeters here. And I think we're just going to raise that engine up just a little bit. Now, fortunately, raising this engine up is fairly straightforward at this point. We're just undoing our straps, and this engine gets lifted up just a little bit, couple millimeters if that, and then we're going to tighten those straps back down. So let's Let's work on that. All right, so we've got our engine adjusted here. It's all tightened down and solid now. One of the little helping tools here to get this raised up is it's obviously very difficult to get your hands underneath there. So you just take some 4mm tubing over the front and the back of the engine, and you can lift it up. If it doesn't want to just come up nice and easy, what I've done is had both of these loosened off. I lifted the back section, did the back one up, put some tension on the front, did the front one up, and now we are centered. That looks great. Got a good profile around the tail cone, good angles, very happy. So now with our tabs adjusted, we should be able to unbolt our engine from the bypass, and that should all be easy to adjust because we do have to sand this area out a little bit because it's deforming the fuselage. We're gonna have to sand our hatch around those areas a little bit as well, but that is awesome. So now that we've got the engine in, we can put our plug in here and we can look at our finer details. Now, I don't think the bypass cover is going to fit with the plug right there. I know the bypass cover is going to be very close to these bolts and such, and this sits about 5 to 8mm higher than those guys. So I think that's going to be an issue. We do get a little bit more space as we kind of rotate to the side. So these are those finer details that you really need to take a look at as you're doing an engine install like this. So let's not get too happy that we've got it bolted in, because what needs to happen is this engine needs to rotate a little bit. Now, some engines are less picky than others as far as rotating them off noon or vertical where the manufacturer recommends having them. So I know like Swiewin's, for example, pretty rock solid. If the fuel fitting is the top, if the engine's moved to 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock, really doesn't make a difference. With Zykoy engines, I don't know. I've never rotated one off center, so we'll see how it works. I know with some of the red engines out there, they tend to be way more picky, or at least they used to be when I used to run them all the time. So just keep an eye on that. Obviously, during the first start, we need to keep an eye on things and make sure that we start perfectly every single time and the starting isn't an issue. If it was an issue, so we're going to go, depending on which way you're looking at it, we're going to go this way on the engine. So looking from the front we're going to go counterclockwise. If it doesn't start really well or consistently, we'll just take that engine and we'll go the other direction. So if we're looking at it this way, if we're going to 10 o'clock with the plug, if it doesn't work well, we'll just go to 2 o'clock on that side. So anyways, that's the plan for that. So we're gonna get that rotated, have to get it recentered and see what happens. Okay, we've got our engine spun here. I think this is all gonna work out good. The other thing I did was took our bands and spun those as well. So we kind of just move that stuff both off to the side a little bit. Our engine lead here is gonna come straight. We're gonna put a little notch in the actual bypass, another little notch in the bypass cover, so that's good. And that's gonna come straight forward, down beside the fuel pump and plug right into our data relay module. We've got the fuel pump mounted there, and I just made a little wood mount, glued it to the side of the base so the fuel pump is removable if needed. And the other thing we did is, if you look closely, you can see the fuel line is already attached to the pump. So I just went with 8mm straight into the pump, and that's going over a piece of 6, and then that's all tie wired, and it comes right to the front here, and that line's already run, so it's ready to plug into our UAT, which is going to sit right there. So everything in this plane is very tight, very snug, very accurate, and I think it's going to work out good. Our actual fuel line here, that's just going to come straight over and go down right here underneath and comes up beside the other side of the tank. So we can just put a little hole in our bypass and have that line go straight into the fuel line. Now our fuel line, I think, right now is directly on the bottom. So, but that doesn't matter. You can just have your fuel line going wherever, because the engine's got a swivel 90-degree on it. So, all right guys, and that wraps up video number 4 in the build series of the Super Bandit, or the assembly portion anyways. Like I always say, we're making some awesome progress on this plane. We have all of our installation to finish and some test runs of this engine, and looking forward to that. So Just a couple final points here for you. Don't forget to check out the Lighter Side of RC After Dark. The After Dark series or channel is where we do live streams from the shop, about 2 hours every 2 weeks. It's awesome because you guys get to interact with us and we can ask questions and you can ask questions and it's just a blast. So definitely check that out. It's a completely separate channel and there is some links down below. Thank you for watching, guys, and we will see you in the next video.